Have you ever taken a long drive at night? Just you, maybe your partner beside you, and the headlights are cutting through the pitch black darkness. It's peaceful, right? But there's this little voice in the back of your head sometimes that wonders, what if? What if something goes wrong out here, miles away from anyone that could help? Picture yourself on an isolated stretch of road, the kind of place where cell signals go to die. You pull over for just a second, maybe to talk, maybe to stretch your legs. It's silent and dark, and it's the kind of quiet that starts to feel heavy. Suddenly, headlights flash behind you. A car approaches slowly, pulls alongside you, and stops. Would your heart jump? Would you lock your doors? Or would you just wave casually, never suspecting the secrets that are hiding behind those lights? Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 72 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyrleigha, and I'm here with my co-host, the one that's affectionately known as Dada at home, my husband, Jonathan.
Darklivity is the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light. And hi.
You forgot hi. Remember the first episode ever? Welcome to the very first episode of the Darklivity podcast. I'm Kimbyrleigha, and this is my boyfriend, John.
Hi.
You're just going to say hi?
I can't ask them how they're doing. I can't respond.
Been a while.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of it being a while, thank you so much for being subscribed. If you're not, though, please subscribe. Always hit the like button if you obviously like the video. But we are so close to 100,000 subscribers.
2,000?
Oh my gosh, it's so close. So don't forget to subscribe. Also tell your friends about our channel if you haven't done so already. But let's now jump back into this case. It was around 10 p.m. on November 20th of 1999. Officer Tony Castillo was making his usual rounds. Ortega Highway, it isn't exactly bustling. It's a lonely two-way road that you would dread driving alone. The kind of place where Castillo said he always felt it was the perfect place to be a dumping ground for crime evidence and murder victims. Just because of how desolate this area was. He was on his way to check the gates of Ortega Rock Cement Plant near mile marker 9, making sure that nothing was out of place, when his headlights caught something that he thought was unusual. A silver Dodge parked oddly on the shoulder of the road. So he slowed down to see what was going on. And as he pulled up, he could tell the passenger's door was open. And when he got closer, he saw what looked like a foot hanging outside. For a split second, Castillo's mind raced through harmless scenarios at first. Maybe someone stopped to stretch. Maybe they're just taking a breather or fixing a flat. He reassured himself and continued driving. But that foot lingered in his thoughts. Something about it just felt wrong. But he kept going.
And on his way back, the car was still there. The door hadn't moved. The foot hadn't budged. And now that silence felt different. It became heavier, thicker, and more dangerous. So, trusting his gut, Castillo pulled a quick U-turn and approached the parked Dodge again. This time, much slower and much more deliberate. The engine was still running, the headlights casting a glow on the asphalt. Castillo stepped towards the driver's side. His heart was beating hard. It was almost echoing in that silence. And that's when he could tell that the driver's side window had been shattered. Two figures sat unmoving inside, a man slumped forward over the steering wheel, and a woman leaning awkwardly lying on top of his lap, both dressed as if they'd come straight from a night out. He didn't know yet, but this was Kenneth and Carolyn Stahl. He intuitively knew that they were probably not okay.
And it only took a single glance inside to confirm his fears. Blood was smeared across the windows and seats, even on the passenger side exterior panel near the door. The two motionless bodies, a single high heel lying on the pavement right above the woman's feet. But there is a lot of folklore in this area. That specific call box that this car was parked in front of has gained a reputation in the local community and online as part of the haunted history of the treacherous winding Ortega Highway that connects Orange and Riverside counties. It's actually categorized as an unlucky and infamous call box on this route. The Riverside killer, William Suff, actually disposed of several victims in the nearby area. And then there was William Bonin, the freeway killer, who is said to have used the same route as well. Two Williams, both serial killers, both driving down the same lonely highway with bad intentions.
And then suddenly, the quiet, lonely stretch of road erupted into a frenzy of radio calls, flashing lights and emergency crews racing to the scene. As Castillo stepped back, one thought consumed him. What the hell happened here tonight?
And if you were scrolling social media today and you stumbled upon a couple like Kenneth and Carolyn, you would probably pause and think that they looked perfect, like they stepped straight out of a lifestyle magazine. Kenneth, or Ken, as friends knew him, was a prominent doctor, an anesthesiologist to be exact, someone that people trusted with their lives.
Ken was born on February 15th of 1942 in Pomona, California. Ken was deeply rooted in a family where medicine ran in the blood. His father, Dr. William Stahl, was a respected surgeon with his own small hospital, and his mom, Bobby, was a dedicated nurse. So, becoming a doctor was almost inevitable. Growing up attending First Baptist Church of Pomona, Ken was that kid who effortlessly balanced Sunday school with football practice. And he wasn't just good at everything, he was exceptional. He earned a scholarship to the University of Laverne right near his hometown, and he didn't stop there. After his bachelor's degree, he powered through medical school at Kansas College of Osteopathic Medicine, eventually becoming a well-respected anesthesiologist. After finishing his medical training, Ken began his career outside of California. During the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, he practiced medicine in Oklahoma for about 5 years. Eventually, he returned to Southern California and settled in Orange County, and then he went on to establish and operate his own pain management clinic for several years.
Now, he had been married 2 times, and both ended in divorce, and one produced a son, Kent, who lived back in Texas. And beyond his impressive career credentials, Ken Stahl was dedicated almost obsessively to taking care of himself. And obviously, as a doctor, he would care about his body. But this really stemmed from his father passing away in 1980 due to heart problems. Ken became laser focused on his health. He regularly completed insane hikes. We're talking over 25-mile treks, cycling marathons through Orange County, and cross-country skiing adventures whenever he got the chance. He watched what he ate. He made a conscious effort to be as healthy as he could be. But despite all of that, he suffered from severe heart disease, and at 35 years old, he had a coronary bypass surgery, followed by a heart attack just 2 years later at 37. Afterward, he once again went back to exercising and dieting, but that didn't stop. A quadruple bypass in July of 1999, but it didn't slow him down. Everyone admired that about Ken. He was relentless and strong. But we have to back up just a little to when he had that heart attack at 37 years old in 1979, because that's how he met Carolyn May Sokolowski.
She went by Carolyn Opie and was 24 at that time. Their paths first crossed during Ken's recovery. They met in the doctor's lounge at Rio Hondo Hospital in Pico Rivera, where Ken was working as an anesthesiologist.
Carolyn was born on November 19th of 1955 in Detroit, Michigan. People who knew her said she was always beautiful, even did beauty pageants growing up, the type of woman that people naturally gravitated towards. She pursued a career in optometry, eventually graduating from Southern College of Optometry and settling into a fulfilling career at Lakewood Eye Physicians and Surgeons Clinic. Patients absolutely adored her, and colleagues did as well. Dr. Mark Mintz, who worked alongside her, described Carolyn as someone who carried an almost angelic presence. Her kindness was genuine, her voice was soothing, and her smile put even the most nervous patients at ease. She, like Ken, had been married and also divorced once before, and though she moved away from her hometown, she remained incredibly close with her mom, Ophia, and her sister, Linda. They spoke almost every day, leaning on one another for life's ups and downs.
When Carolyn met Ken, she admired his maturity, his discipline, and his resilience, and it wasn't long before they were officially dating, and eventually she moved in with him. She was captivated by the excitement and adventure Ken brought into their life.
Now, I had to read this a few times just to make sure I had it correct, but it appears that this couple dated for almost 10 years before they got married. They eloped in Vegas on January 1st of 1988 saying midnight vows. Now, they had already settled into an upscale townhouse in the Pacific Ranch community in Huntington Beach a few years before this, and their life quickly became a vibrant blur of long weekdays, hospital galas, whitewater rafting adventures in Colorado, and hiking escapes to Montana, where Ken had a cozy cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Neighbors watched with admiration, almost envy. How did they manage all of it? Thriving careers, boundless adventures, and seemingly unshakable love. Busy? Always. Stressed? Never seemed so. Energized? Absolutely.
From the outside, Ken and Carolyn appeared to be the couple living their best lives, genuinely happy and deeply connected. Their social circle admired them, their family felt pride, and acquaintances aspired to have what they had. It's the kind of love story that you would see on social media nowadays, right?
Yeah, you would scroll their entire timeline thinking, wow, some people really do have it all.
But you know what they say, pictures tell 1,000 words, but they never tell the whole story.
Ain't that the truth? So we're going to jump back to November 20th, 1999. Recall Ken had just had a quadruple bypass a few months earlier in July, but he'd been doing really well. It was a Saturday evening. It was the kind of night couples like them would mark on their calendars, because for Kenneth and Carolyn Stahl, this wasn't just any Saturday. Carolyn had just turned 44 the day before, and that night was her special birthday dinner. Ken had planned everything down to the last detail exactly how Carolyn would have loved it. A peaceful evening out, a quiet meal, just the two of them enjoying each other's company. But later that night, things changed.
So let's go back to around 10 p.m. Officer Tony Castillo was driving his usual police route along Ortega Highway, that remote stretch of road cutting through the rugged hills of Southern California. If you've ever driven a road like Ortega at night, you know how unsettling it could be. There's a sort of haunting calmness with nothing around for miles but wilderness and the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. It's eerie. Castillo was accustomed to the silence, almost comforted by the routine checks, locking gates, securing premises, scanning the road. But as he passed that 8-mile marker, he noticed something that we told you about. On the shoulder of the road, dimly illuminated by his headlights, sat that silver Dodge Stratus, the front passenger door hanging open, and sticking awkwardly out of that door were what looked like legs.
He passed by and continued to secure the nearby Ortega rock cement plant. His mind refused to let go of that image, though, because something felt off. It just felt wrong. It wasn't just what he saw, it was how it made him feel. And that's why he drove back. And the Dodge was exactly as it was before. Door still open, engine quietly running, and Ken was in the driver's seat slumped forward, still secured by his seatbelt, motionless, his head tilted awkwardly, and leaning against him was his wife Carolyn, lifeless and covered in blood. The interior was covered in blood spatter as well. It was all over the dashboard, the windshield, the seats. And outside, near the rear passenger's tire, a lone high-heel shoe lay on the ground with a large smear of blood across the exterior of the car.
And within minutes, emergency lights cut through the darkness. First responders moved swiftly, but even their professional urgency couldn't mask their shock at the violence and brutality of the scene. And it didn't take long for emergency personnel to determine that Kenneth and Carolyn were beyond help. Their lives were taken in a ruthless, devastating attack. It appeared that someone had shot them. Officers carefully closed off the road, sealing the area for forensic analysis. Detectives arrived on scene, determined to piece together what had happened here tonight, and most importantly, why.
What had brought Kenneth and Carolyn Stahl there tonight? Why did they stop on that desolate stretch of road? And who could have possibly wanted them dead? Now, the deeper investigators dug, the stranger and darker the story would become. Lead forensic specialist Lori Crutchfield had arrived around 11:30 p.m., working tirelessly through the darkness and into the morning. Her team carefully documented the crime scene, photographing every single detail.
As the morning sun slowly rose on Sunday, November 21st of 1999, the normally tranquil Ortega Highway looked nothing like its daytime self. Police cruisers, ambulances, and crime scene vans crowded the roadway, their flashing lights shining through the early morning fog. Detectives and forensic teams moved systematically around the silver Dodge Stratus, meticulously documenting every detail. A devastating injury was immediately visible on Kenneth Stahl's head, a gunshot wound to the back of his skull directly behind his left ear, and it exited through his right eye socket. The impact had completely destroyed his eye, leaving fragments of shattered bone and tissue on the dashboard and gearshift. His wire-rimmed glasses were twisted, barely clinging to his face.
This reminded me of the way that Dan Markel was found, even down to the glasses being broken. Ken had also suffered additional gunshot wounds. One bullet had pierced his left arm just above the elbow, traveling through his tricep before entering his upper chest and ultimately exiting his back. Another shot, particularly brutal, entered just below his left collarbone.
Carolyn Opie-Stahl's injuries were even more numerous and horrific. Her body had twisted awkwardly, her head resting near Kenneth's lap. Crutchfield documented multiple gunshot wounds between 6 and 10 in total. Bullets had struck her left breast and beneath it, and multiple others had entered and exited along the right side of her body. But the most catastrophic was the shot to the back of her head, fracturing her skull and passing cleanly through her brain, causing instant death.
I mean, it is horrible, and we are telling you the details, but it's exactly what occurred from all the medical records. And there were blood that had this disturbing trail leading from the passenger side door to the rear passenger side tire. And that's where Carolyn's red and black high heel shoe was discarded. Her bare foot was resting limply against the pavement, and the other shoe was barely clinging inside the car. Crutchfield noted fragments of bone on the passenger side dashboard, likely from that devastating head injury that Carolyn had sustained. Bullet damage clearly showed shots were fired from very close range, likely from someone standing directly outside of the passenger side. The driver's side window had been partially down when it was struck, which was indicated by a neat bullet defect around 18 inches left of the door handle and shattered glass shards both inside and outside the vehicle. A larger quantity of shattered glass had fallen inside the door panel, supporting the idea that Kenneth may have briefly spoken or interacted with the attacker before being fatally shot.
Investigators searched tirelessly for shell casings around the vehicle and surrounding area, but there were none. The absence led forensic experts to believe that the murder weapon was a revolver, which retained spent casings, or maybe that someone had picked them all up, adding to another chilling layer to the calculated nature of this crime. The bodies were carefully transported to the Orange County Medical Examiner's Office, where Dr. David Katsuyama conducted meticulous autopsies, cataloging the extent of their injuries. He confirmed 57-year-old Kenneth Stahl's cause of death was exsanguination, which is severe blood loss, resulting from the fragmented bullet that entered his body, causing massive internal trauma, severing both lungs and his aorta, resulting in rapid and fatal blood loss. Despite the horrific gunshot wound to his head, it alone might not have immediately killed him, suggesting that Kenneth may have briefly survived, perhaps unconscious, until internal bleeding rapidly ended his life. The autopsy also revealed that Kenneth had severe underlying heart disease at the time of his death. His aorta was significantly clogged, and medical findings suggested that he was at high risk for another heart attack.
All of that is so devastating to think about. And 44-year-old Carolyn's autopsy was also deeply troubling. She died from excessive blood loss as well. Her injuries were so numerous that they couldn't distinguish where the entrance wounds were and where the exit wounds were. Her internal injuries were extensive. Bullets damaged critical organs, including her liver, spleen, lung, and bowel. 2 intact bullets were recovered near her back, lodged deeply after causing internal trauma. The fatal shot had been fired directly into the back of her head, instantly fatal. They called it overkill because it was more than enough to have caused her death. This is usually done in an act of rage or anger. And as for the time of death, it was estimated by the partially digested food that was found in both of the victims' stomachs that it happened approximately 1 to 1.5 hours before their bodies were discovered at 10 p.m. So we're looking at 8:30 or 9.
While the forensic team pieced together physical clues, detectives began the heartbreaking task of notifying family members. Kenneth's mother, Bobby, was shocked and heartbroken upon hearing the news. She expressed disbelief, anguish, and confusion. Kenneth had always been the careful one, a conservative driver, a cautious man, and Bobby had believed that he'd be the one looking after her years later, not that she would be planning his funeral.
I don't think any parent thinks that they're going to outlive their child, especially when you know he's a grown man, he's cautious, and he's alert, and he's a protector. He really was. And Carolyn's family was equally shattered. Her mother fell into uncontrollable sobs. She was inconsolable for weeks. The devastating loss of her daughter caused her to be unable to sleep without taking medicine, and she withdrew from even her closest friends. Carolyn's sister, Linda, spoke of the profound shock, emphasizing how deeply Carolyn had touched the lives of everyone around her with her kindness and her generosity. And for her mother, the grief was magnified by the violence that she knew her daughter had endured. Violence she simply could not comprehend happening to such a kind, thoughtful, and gentle woman.
As detectives expanded their inquiries, they spoke with colleagues and neighbors, each echoing the disbelief and devastation felt by the family members. Carolyn's coworkers struggled deeply with the news, describing her loss as unimaginable. Dr. Carl Hartman, Carolyn's supervisor, expressed his disbelief, calling both Kenneth and Carolyn almost too good to be true. Those kind of people, it's impossible to imagine that they were victims of such violence.
Yeah, like who would have wanted to hurt someone like this? That's what they were thinking. Friends from the couple's social circle expressed shock and grief, describing Kenneth and Carolyn as deeply in love and happy. And their neighbors in Huntington Beach recalled them as energetic, adventurous, with no visible signs of trouble or conflict in their lives whatsoever. They were the type of neighbors who would not strike you as problematic, meaning there wasn't a police presence, there was no yelling or anything unusual coming from their townhouse. Just a nice couple who had been married for over a decade. But there was one neighbor, and when they gently pressed them, they mentioned seeing an unfamiliar vehicle that would occasionally be parked in their driveway at odd hours, usually when Ken was home alone. Now, detectives filed this information cautiously. They weren't sure exactly what to make of it.
But here's the real question that detectives wanted the answer to first. Why was Kenneth and Carolyn on such an isolated stretch of road? Ortega Highway. It wasn't their normal route, particularly not late at night, especially if Kenneth was expected to be at work early the next morning. This area was nothing like Huntington Beach at all. It's almost an hour away up towards the mountains. Sure, there's a wildlife park nearby.
But this was late at night, and they're not dressed for the outdoors either. There were no signs of a robbery. Carolyn's purse and Kenneth's wallet remained untouched. The attack seemed personal, yet so random. Nothing about this crime made sense. And as the forensic teams wrapped up their exhaustive search and their documentation, they collected swabs of blood for DNA testing, and the highway eventually reopened, slowly returning to its usual quiet rhythm. Yet investigators were left with haunting evidence: the shattered glass, blood trails, catastrophic injuries, and multiple unanswered questions. Who had committed such an appalling, violent crime against this seemingly perfect couple? And why had it looked like Carolyn briefly stepped out of the car before returning to her seat? And what could have possibly brought Kenneth and Carolyn out to this isolated road to begin with on a night intended for celebration? I can't help but think about the case we recently did of the Black Widow, the redhead. What was her name?
Stacy Scheck.
Yes, just a desolate, weird, isolated area, the car, the shooting. But I digress. If you haven't watched that, though, we'll link it on the screen at the end of this video.
Detective Jim McDonald and Detective Joe Horns, tasked with initial inquiries, conducting extensive interviews with family, coworkers, and acquaintances, methodically searching for anything unusual in Kenneth and Carolyn Stahl's lives that might hint at a motive. By Sunday afternoon, Kenneth's mother, Bobby Stahl Polly, and his sisters Diana and Tamara arrived at the scene. They were visibly shaken and very confused. Talking to the investigators, their disbelief was obvious. Bobby told detectives this made absolutely no sense. Ken was cautious, he was obsessively careful, especially when it came to his health and safety, and he wouldn't have put himself or Carolyn at risk willingly. So what had brought them out there? She could not fathom any reason they'd drive all this way. It's almost like they were forced to.
And that's an interesting theory. Like, what if at a different spot, someone got into their car, held them at gunpoint, and told them to drive?
But then, what would the motive be to kill them, especially if no valuables were taken?
True. Carolyn's family, too, they were struggling to figure this out. They were trying to think of anyone with a problem with her, and nobody came to mind. They even said that Carolyn usually spent her birthdays quietly at home, talking on the phone with her mom.
So for detectives, the frustration quickly mounted. With no immediate suspects, no clear motive, and conflicting details at the scene that defied explanation, investigators faced the daunting task of piecing together a story from scattered and very confusing clues. Detectives retraced every step Ken and Carolyn had taken that night, questioning restaurant staff and reviewing their movements leading up to their arrival on Ortega Highway.
Next, they examined Ken's pager, for recent contacts. One number that had paged him around 8 p.m. belonged to Dr. Aquilino Tan, a colleague at Pacifica Hospital in Huntington Beach. So they made their way over there to speak to him. Dr. Tan explained he had asked Ken if he could provide anesthesia for a dental surgery that was scheduled for 6:30 in the following morning. But Ken called him back and let him know, sorry, I'm not going to be able to do that. He mentioned he was celebrating Carolyn's birthday. It seemed like a simple conversation at the time, but now detectives noted it as a possible clue, as in, why was Kenneth out so late if he had such an early commitment? Was it normal behavior for him? And calling in like that didn't seem ordinary. Why would he already know that he wouldn't make it to work after Saturday night? Did he think that maybe they're going to be out late and possibly he didn't want the pressure of getting up really early? Or was it something else?
There were theories. Road rage. Maybe someone was pissed off on that 2-lane highway. Maybe Ken was driving really slow, taking in the scenery and the night with his wife, and somebody wanted to pass him. And when they did, maybe they ran him off the road. Or maybe Ken stopped to pull over at a call box, ask for help, and when he stopped, that angry stranger fired rounds into both of them. Maybe that's why Carolyn jumped out of the car. Maybe it was to call for help, but she was intercepted, which forced her back to the passenger seat, but not before someone shot her. That could be why there was blood smeared on the side of the car, or could this have been some sort of targeted hit? Like someone either tricked them into meeting them out there, or maybe even followed them that night.
All of that was a maybe, because Detective McDonald and Horns didn't know it yet, but the truth they were about to uncover would be even darker and more tangled than anyone could have even imagined. Behind the facade of Ken and Carolyn's outwardly perfect life lurked secrets that were so troubling and so shocking that it would change everything they thought they knew about this picture-perfect couple. But for now, the answers remain just out of reach, hidden somewhere beyond the yellow tape, gently along Ortega Highway, where silence and shadows held tightly onto their secrets. Detectives knew it was time to look beyond what was immediately visible. They needed to see behind the carefully maintained image that Ken and Carolyn showed to the world. Detective McDonald and Detective Horns began meticulously combing through the couple's lives. Colleagues described them both as professional. Dr. Stahl was known as reliable and meticulous. No one mentioned any known issues or recent conflicts, so they had to go even broader.
And in doing so, they tracked down a handyman named Richard Anaya, who had consistently worked at Stahl's townhouse. He'd known the couple for years, but said he was friends with Ken, not just someone who worked for him. Because when he came to fix things, he noticed that Ken would stop to talk to him, and soon Richard noticed that he would call him over, not just for electrical work, but just to talk. It wasn't long before Richard realized that as popular and well-liked as Ken was, it seemed he really wasn't close to anyone, and he didn't confide in his friends. He just started confiding in Richard. And he may have felt more comfortable with Richard because, as Richard put it, he was from the streets. He didn't have doctor friends. It's as though he thought Richard wouldn't judge him, and eventually they started working out together regularly at the gym.
When Richard heard that the detectives were there to speak to him because Ken was dead, he could not believe it, because out of everyone he knew, he would have never expected Ken would be murdered. And he was willing to cooperate with the police. Until this point, everyone the detectives had spoken to that was close to this couple had nothing but positive things to say about them. But Richard had a different perspective. He said that about a year ago, back in 1998, he could tell that Ken had fallen into a depression, and he talked to him about it. Ken said one afternoon while he was working, Carolyn barged into his office and started rummaging through paperwork right in front of his staff and in front of his patients. She was having a breakdown because she believed he was cheating. And the thing is, Carolyn's first marriage had ended in infidelity. Her ex-husband had been cheating, and he decided he wanted to be with the other woman. So he filed for divorce. He basically just sent her a decree to sign. That was it. No talking, no counseling, no trying to make it work. So was she hypersensitive about cheating? Yes. And when Ken was telling all this to Richard, he was like, but you would never do that. He knew their relationship. They were close. They were in love and happy. But at that point, it just seemed like things were not working out, that Carolyn didn't trust Ken, and it was beginning to erode their marriage.
Richard basically asked him, why don't you just get a divorce if you're not happy? And Ken said, oh, we're happy. It's not a big deal. It will be fine. And Richard says he never saw any signs that Ken had been unfaithful.
But to be fair, he only hung out with Ken at the gym or at his home when he was doing repairs.
Speaking of their townhome, one interesting thing that detectives discovered inside of Carolyn's closet, they were able to tally over $30,000 worth of clothing and accessories that still had tags. And her friends and family were questioned about this. They were a little surprised because they had recognized some of the items as things that they were told by Carolyn that Ken had bought for her. Different holidays like Valentine's Day or Christmas, so it seemed odd that they'd be sitting there unused.
Yeah, it was strange. I mean, imagine all that clothing with tags on it. And there were things that people had seen in photos or that she had brought out and said, like, look what I just got for Valentine's Day. There was an apparent effort for Carolyn to keep up with the Joneses, as they say. She was always going on shopping sprees, showing off expensive purses, shoes, and other items. However, when investigators started looking into the couple's finances, they realized that Carolyn was purchasing all of these things on her own. And eventually, they figured out from those closest to her that shopping was her therapy. Whenever she was in an argument with Ken or she wasn't feeling well about something and she wasn't having a good day, she would go spend money. But what they found out was odd. She wanted other women to be envious of her life and also of her relationship by saying things like, oh, don't you just love this purse? Ken bought it for me. But in fact, he hadn't.
Clearly, this was not a picture-perfect relationship, but what relationship is? They had to dig deeper and ask the right questions to the right people.
Especially considering the length it seemed this couple went to keep up appearances.
They had to cut through the facade. They needed to see behind the carefully maintained image that Ken and Carolyn had shown the world. Detective Jim McDonald and Detective Joe Horns began meticulously combing through the couple's lives. Bank accounts, phone records, interviews with coworkers, friends, and family. Everything needed to be closely examined. Even the smallest details mattered. Was Ken really faithful? Or did Carolyn have a reason to accuse him of cheating? And if he was, did it have anything to do with the murders?
These detectives were working non-stop. They weren't sleeping. They weren't going home to their own families. And this was right before the Thanksgiving holiday. But they were determined to find a lead in this case. By now, the media had been running stories about the double murder. It made headlines. 2 affluent doctors gunned down after a birthday dinner, and tips started to pour in. One potential eyewitness that had been on Ortega Highway on the same night. So Detective McDonald sat down with this woman on Tuesday, November 30th. She explained that at the time, she didn't even know if it was significant, but looking back, she believed it may be connected to the murders. She carefully recounted how she had been driving westbound on that dark, winding highway. It was close to 9 p.m., and the highway was deserted. It was just total darkness.
And as she passed one of those isolated roadside call boxes, her headlights briefly illuminated a vehicle that she remembered was parked strangely. She thought it was maybe an off-white or beige full-sized car facing east, sitting silently in a turnout with its lights completely off. Something about that stillness caught her attention. At that exact moment, she noticed another car approaching from the opposite direction, traveling west towards her.
She vividly recalled how this second car, possibly a Saturn or an Eclipse, she wasn't certain, moved past her very slowly, almost cautiously. She watched carefully in her rearview mirror, and that's when her curiosity deepened. When moments after passing her, the car slowed down. Then it paused momentarily, and then it took an abrupt U-turn. She said her heart was racing, and this is because she saw this vehicle deliberately head back towards the turnout where that beige car was just waiting silently, like they were meeting up, but not for a good reason, because she had to rationalize it to herself so she wouldn't get scared. Remember, this was a highway where serial killers had dumped evidence and victims. She wondered if it was maybe just someone who missed a turn or they were meeting a friend, but that didn't seem likely. And now that she knew what unfolded that night, she thought that maybe she witnessed the killer driving towards the stall's pulled over vehicle. Unfortunately, at the moment, she didn't think to get license plates or even get a good glimpse at the occupants.
So Detective McDonald carefully pieced together the timeline. The witness's sighting at roughly 9 p.m. placed this strange roadside interaction almost precisely between 2 critical known moments. Kenneth Stahl's earlier conversation with Dr. Aquilino Tan around 8 p.m. and Officer Tony Castillo's chilling discovery of the Stahl's vehicle at around 10 p.m. Detective McDonald strongly suspected that the beige car, the one that the witness observed parked quietly by the call box, was indeed the Stahl silver Dodge Stratus. And the second vehicle, the one that executed that abrupt U-turn, very likely belonged to whoever was responsible for Kenneth and Carolyn's tragic fate. That witness, without even realizing it, had caught a glimpse of the haunting moment just before the two lives were taken. But it still really didn't provide any solid leads, but it did possibly narrow down the timeline and provide details about the other car. And that's about it.
So they had to keep digging. Remember when we mentioned that they had to ask the right people the right questions? Well, that's because not everyone is willing to offer up certain information unless they're asked directly. And once colleagues were questioned point blank about whether Ken was having an affair, the answer became, which one?
Oh no.
Oh, yes. They called him a philanderer. It didn't even start with Carolyn either. On paper, his relationship history looked straightforward. 2 previous marriages before Carolyn, we mentioned that. But when detectives spoke to people who actually knew him back then, the story became more complicated. His first marriage, they learned, hadn't just ended, it unraveled after Ken had an affair. And not long after that, he married the same woman he'd been involved with.
But that marriage didn't last either. In fact, it didn't even make it past 3 months. And it was annulled quickly and quietly, almost like it never had happened. And now detectives are sitting there thinking, oh, okay, so this isn't just bad luck in relationships. There's a pattern here. At first, everything about their early years together seemed romantic.
But about a year into living together and a few years after officially dating, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum. She didn't want to be the live-in girlfriend. It was either he married her or it was over. The problem was, people close to Ken said he wasn't exactly eager to get married again, especially after 2 failed marriages. He had reservations, 10 years of them apparently, because they don't officially tie the knot until 1988. But ultimately, he agreed. And according to his family members, one of the biggest influences in that decision was his mother, Bobby, who absolutely adored Carolyn. She saw her as the perfect partner for her son, the kind of woman who could ground him, stabilize him. She was his match. Also a doctor, talented, smart, and successful.
But around 1993 or 94, we're talking about 5 or 6 years into the marriage, something happens that no one could ignore. Carolyn comes back to California early from a trip home to Michigan. And when she walks through her living room doors, she finds another woman there, just sitting in her space. Can you imagine?
No, I can't. And if you have any idea who Betty Broderick is, well then if you know, you know.
For Carolyn, it was confusion, the disbelief. It's like your brain trying to catch up with what your eyes are really seeing. Ken was clearly cheating. So the couple does what a lot of couples do after something like that. They go to counseling, they try to fix it, they try to move forward. But according to people close to them, it didn't stop. Ken continued having affairs.
And this is where things start to get even more uncomfortable. Carolyn's sister Linda eventually confronted Ken directly. She doesn't dance around it. She calls him out on his infidelity. And according to Linda, his response wasn't defensive or apologetic or even emotional. It was just indifferent. Almost like, deal with it. This is who I am. Take it or leave it. I'm not changing for anyone. Almost like a sign that Carolyn was free to exit the relationship if she didn't like it. No real remorse, no urgency to change.
So why get married?
Well, he was hesitant.
Right, and this was probably the reason why.
And then there's another incident that Linda describes that really stands out to investigators. At some point, Carolyn becomes suspicious enough that she goes through a locked desk in their home. She clearly believed that Ken was hiding something. And when he finds out, according to Linda, that's when things escalate. She says that Ken got physical, that he struck Carolyn, leaving bruises on her hips, on her arms. And Carolyn confided in her sister. She was crying. She was hurt. She was clearly struggling.
And this is the part that sticks with investigators the most. She still doesn't leave. Despite everything, despite the affairs, the humiliation, the physical confrontation, Carolyn stays. And now detectives are looking at this marriage in a completely different light. Behind closed doors, there were secrets. There was tension. There were things no one talked about publicly. And suddenly, investigators are starting to wonder what else they were hiding.
Debt was one other thing. When it came to Carolyn, her spending habits landed her in tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt. It's sad because she wanted the marriage to work. And she wanted people to believe Ken was doting on her and was buying all these presents when really she bought her own Christmas presents. And she would put little labels on them that said, "From Ken," just so that other people would think that she was still his number one, still desired, when all the while many people knew he was doting on other women. She must have felt like a fool. But I don't blame her because she truly loved her husband. She probably thought things would get better. As detectives are digging into Carolyn's finances, Ken's sister Tamara had been helping to sort through Ken's as well. But we'll get back to that.
On Saturday of November 28th, 1999, a joint funeral service was held for Kenneth Stahl and Carolyn Opie Stahl at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach. The church was filled with people who knew them as the successful doctor, the kind, soft-spoken optometrist, friends, coworkers, neighbors, people who were trying to make sense of how two lives that looked so perfectly put together could end so violently and so suddenly. But even in a place meant for mourning, there was something else in the air. Something investigative.
During the service, as guests arrived, they did what you always do at a funeral. They signed the memorial registry book. Names, signatures, short messages, a quiet way of paying respects. But this time, it didn't feel entirely routine because by then, word had already started circulating within the family that investigators had been collecting handwriting samples from people in Ken and Carolyn's inner circle. Quietly, subtly, without making a scene or explaining why. So now, as people lined up to sign that book, some family members couldn't help but wonder, was this just a memorial or was it also a piece of evidence? No one said it out loud. No one would confirm it. But the thought lingered that even here, at their funeral, the investigation hadn't stopped.
At the graveside, Kenneth's mother Bobby stood in front of everyone trying to process a reality that did not make sense to her. Losing her only son was already unbearable, but the unanswered questions, the violence, it all made it feel even more unreal.
And what she said next really shows me where her mind was. She couldn't believe and would not believe that anyone close to this couple would be responsible. To her, their circle was made up of good people, professionals, friends, people that she trusted. She described them simply as clean as snow. So go look somewhere else, right? And we have that instinct to protect the version of reality that feels the safest, because the alternative would mean that someone that was sitting in that very church, someone that could be signing that very book, might not be who they appear to be at all.
But before we get back into the finances, there was some new information discovered. Forensic specialist Laurie Crutchfield carefully examined each bullet recovered from the crime scene. Under a high-powered comparison microscope, she analyzed the tiny distinctive markings etched into the copper-jacketed projectiles, unique grooves and patterns left behind as the bullet traveled through the barrel of the gun. With meticulous precision, Crutchfield referenced the FBI's General Rifling Characteristics Guide, comparing essential forensic details, caliber, bullet weight, diameter, the exact number of lands and grooves, and even the specific direction of the rifling twist etched onto each projectile.
After a detailed analysis, she was able to narrow down the type of firearm that was likely used. The possibilities pointed clearly towards specific revolvers, either a .38 Special, a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, or a Taurus .357 Magnum. So this conclusion matched investigators' earlier suspicions perfectly. They found no shell casings at the scene. And since revolvers, unlike a semi-automatic, don't eject casings after firing, this indicated a carefully considered choice of a weapon, something quiet, reliable, and difficult to trace.
Using the bullet trajectories and forensic evidence gathered at the scene, investigators painstakingly pieced together a tentative reconstruction of the shooting. It appeared the attack began on the driver's side where Kenneth sat. Detectives believe that the first shots likely shattered the partially open driver's side window, bullets striking Kenneth as he sat behind the wheel. Carolyn, sitting in the passenger seat, may have been struck either by gunfire passing through the driver's side or possibly by bullets passing through Kenneth's body and then into hers.
And then something significant and troubling happened. Let's recall the blood droplets, the smears, Carolyn's discarded high heel shoe found near the rear passenger side tire. It painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture as they believed at some point, maybe after being initially wounded, Carolyn managed to escape that vehicle. maybe desperately trying to flee from her attacker or even using the call box. But the investigators still struggled to fully explain why she ultimately got back inside the car. Maybe the killer had come to that side of the car and forced her back inside, or maybe out of confusion or shock from her injuries.
And it was at that point that the investigators believed that the shooter approached even closer, standing right beside the open passenger door to fire the final shots, ensuring that Carolyn would not survive.
It was horrific, but it still didn't answer the question of who. So let's go back to the finances. Everything was being looked at. And as we mentioned, Ken's sister Tamara had been going through his financial records shortly after his death. She was initially doing so to assist selling his estate, but also because the detectives were asking questions, and then she noticed something troubling. It was a transaction, a withdrawal of $20,000 in cash from Ken's Union Bank of California account. It was made shortly before the murders. She was immediately alarmed, so she alerted the detectives, who quickly understood the gravity of this discovery.
Ken was always careful with money and always transparent. Detectives knew instantly that this was something they could not ignore. $20,000 in cash didn't just vanish without explanation.
Because it was cash, that looked suspicious as well, like there's no paper trail. So who would he have been paying?
He paid workers, so the detectives went back to Richard and asked if perhaps Ken was having work done on the home and maybe paid Richard in cash. He said no, not that he knew of any work, but then a light bulb went off in his head. Richard all of a sudden remembered something that happened back at the end of the year 1998. That same year, Ken was depressed, in counseling with Carolyn and thinking things were not working out. Richard said he got a call in the middle of the night. It was at least after midnight, and Ken was asking if he could come by and take a look at his smoke detector.
Yeah, it was like annoying him, like the little thing was going off like we sometimes hear.
And Richard was like, well, yeah, are you sure you want me over there now? Ken said, yeah. And during this particular visit, Richard said he noticed Ken looking at some of his tattoos, then asked what they represented. And Richard says these were from his past, and he used to be in a gang, but that was all behind him now.
It seemed that Ken was really interested in hearing about that part of Richard's life, so as he worked on the issues with the smoke alarm, he told him a little about it. And afterward, Ken was like, so did you do drive-by shootings and stuff like that? And Richard was like, I'm not proud of it, but yeah, we did. And then the discussion seemed to devolve into Ken saying something to the effect of, so let's say somebody gave you some money to, I don't know, kill their wife, like if they gave you $70,000 or something. Kind of specific considering Ken was just talking about issues he was having with Carolyn. But Richard was like, well, no, I don't do those types of things anymore. And Ken was like, oh, you know I'm not serious. I'm joking. I'm messing with you, man. And Richard knew he was joking because he was laughing. They were both laughing. And he knew that never in a million years would he ever take that statement seriously. Until now.
So could Ken have been serious? Could he have wanted his wife dead? Well, Richard told detectives Ken never brought it up again. But even if he had found someone to do that, it didn't make any sense because Ken was with Carolyn that night. And he was shot too. So detectives were not leaning heavily into that theory, but there was another one that looked possible.
An orchestration of his own death, kind of like Alec Murdaugh when he hired that guy to shoot him, as in maybe Ken wanted to end it all, him and Carolyn, but not be responsible so that their families would not have any negative thoughts about him. It wasn't that far-fetched because as they were tracking down women who had had affairs with him, two of them mentioned something in relation to violence.
A lady named Denise said that she'd been involved in an affair with Kenneth that dated back to the mid-1990s. And to her, he often seemed deeply unhappy, not just stressed, not just overwhelmed, but emotionally drained. According to her, he would talk about his marriage in ways that felt intense and almost desperate at times. She claimed he described Carolyn as blackmailing him, making him feel trapped, like there was no clean way out. And then the conversations would get darker. Denise said Ken would sometimes talk about not wanting to live anymore, that he felt stuck, and that everything was closing in on him. And in those moments of emotional spiral, he didn't just talk about escaping his life, he talked about ending it. And there were times when he even supposedly mentioned shooting his wife in bursts of anger, frustration, or just emotional breakdowns. But still, to investigators, that kind of language stands out, because even if it was said in just passing, it's not something people just ignore anymore.
The other woman, Patricia, made it very clear that her relationship with Ken had never been romantic. She was just a longtime friend, someone who had known him in a different and more platonic way. But her description of him was just as unsettling. She told detectives that he seemed to live in what she described as a near constant state of depression, that even when he was functioning and working and socializing and going about his life, there was always something heavier underneath. And sometimes it came out in what she referred to as dark humor. Patricia said that he would make these self-deprecating jokes about himself, calling him things like Dr. No Life or Dr. Beyond, almost like he was mocking his own existence, laughing it off, but then not really.
And now detectives are sitting with all this information trying to piece it together, because this isn't just one perspective anymore. It's a pattern, right? It's multiple people, multiple accounts, all pointing to the same thing. A man who behind the polished exterior may have been far more troubled and far more unpredictable than anyone had realized. That $20,000 had to have gone somewhere, and it was February of 2000. Months had passed, and they were now scouring the rest of Ken's pager records. They were looking for any numbers that stuck out, and when looking at Ken's pager log for the night before the crime, one number kept popping up, even on the day of the murders. It was a number from Anaheim, a different part of Orange County, not exactly the upscale neighborhood that the Stalls lived in. This was a much rougher neighborhood. So they traced the number to a woman named Adriana Vasco.
They called the number to see if she would pick up, and she did. When asked who she was and why her number showed up in a dead man's pager log before he was killed, she explained her relationship with Ken. She's like, I'm his receptionist. I'm always in contact with him. She assisted him with everything from bookkeeping to scheduling his patients to dry cleaning. She was like a personal assistant. And without hesitation, the detectives drive down to the office she's working at and speak with Adriana face to face. Now, she was a little surprised that they came down there in person, but when asked specifically why she paged Dr. Stahl so many times on November 19th and even on the 20th, Adriana said she remembers having a broken computer at the office. It needed repairs, and she needed Ken to coordinate funds to have the services conducted on the device. When they pressed her about what she knew Ken was doing that night, she said all she knew was that he had plans to take his wife out to dinner. That's all. She even was able to provide information about the services from CompUSA, which is where the computer was being repaired. It was clear she was one of Ken's employees. That explained why she had been in contact with him.
The investigation really slowed down by this point. There were just no new leads to follow. So a couple of weeks later, on February 29th of 2000, they looked at those pager logs again. They showed that some of Adriana's pages were at night, like 9 or 10 p.m., so they thought, why would a receptionist need to speak with her boss that late? They automatically suspected an affair because of the pattern that Ken had with other women who worked with him over the years.
And not to mention, I do think there's a little bit of a stereotype about secretaries and receptionists and men who are working with them day in and day out, the proximity, and of course the fact that he's also prone to cheating. It just increases the likelihood. So that day, they have a sit-down interview with Adriana at the police station. They find out she's 33. She is small in stature, just under 5 feet tall and weighing about 100 pounds, curly brown hair, brown eyes, and she explained she was a single mother of 2 and had first met Dr. Stahl back in 1990 when she was 23. They were both employed at the National Pain Institute at the time, a clinic located on Center Drive in Huntington Beach, where Adriana worked as a medical assistant and Ken worked elsewhere in the facility performing medical procedures, including trigger point injections that are used to relieve pain. So they had known each other for almost 10 years.
And at first, she said their contact was limited, but that changed about 2 months after she began working there. Adriana came into the clinic one day bruised and in visible discomfort, walking with a limp. Ken treated her injuries, and during that time, she opened up about her personal life. Adriana told detectives she was born in Mexico on February 1st of 1967. Her mother had died in a car accident when she was very young, and she never knew her father. She had been married once to a man named Victor, and they had a son together.
This wasn't a healthy relationship. She was being mistreated physically, and the injuries that were treated by Ken were a result of this repeated behavior. So the doctor responded with kindness and concern. He didn't judge her or even tell her what she should do. But Adriana does confide to the detectives that Dr. Stahl paid for a hotel room so that Adriana and her young son would have a place to stay that was safe. And over time, he told her, "You can stop calling me Dr. Stahl and you can just call me Ken." So she considered him a father figure, a mentor. He would encourage her, believe in her, and of course, offer support when her life didn't feel stable. She did get emotional when they discussed Ken's murder. She had lost someone who was good to her, a boss, someone who cared about her well-being, which she said was not the norm for the people in her life.
But the questions had to get a little harder to answer. The detectives wanted to know if Ken ever opened up to her about his marriage, and Adriana admitted that there were times when Ken was upset and would talk negatively about his wife. When asked for specifics, it wasn't good. There were times he complained about her appearance, including the weight that she put on during the marriage, and also they've grown distant over time and had been sleeping in separate bedrooms. Ken wasn't asking for advice, he was merely venting. And when asked about whether or not Ken talked about ending the relationship with Carolyn, Adriana said that he had mentioned a divorce, but admitted he felt trapped financially because the lawyer had allegedly warned him that after a decade of marriage, his wife would be entitled to things like the house and even a share in his assets.
Yeah, California is a community property state, so whatever you acquire during the marriage, your spouse usually gets half of that. Adriana had also mentioned the same story that Richard said Ken confided in him about when Carolyn had broken into the desk drawer that was locked. He came home to find all of his personal belongings rummaged through, and this made him not want to be at the house. So he admitted that he would take on extra work just so that he didn't have to go home. When asked whether she personally knew Carolyn, Adriana said no, but she did express some frustration with the way that Carolyn was portrayed publicly, as in this perfect wife or a perfect person, when Adriana said she saw a very different side of that marriage, and that one time Carolyn somehow got Adriana's number and she was reaching out to some of Adriana's friends using a fake name, and finally she called Adriana and warned her to stop calling her husband. Adriana felt embarrassed and she was upset because she told Carolyn, "I'm just his employee, nothing more," and to stop reaching out to her and harassing people in her life.
The detectives wanted to delve into whether or not Ken ever spoke about hurting himself, and she said he never outright said that, but he would make comments suggesting that he was tired, stressed out, sick of the conflict with his wife, and even then, it would be easier if he didn't have to deal with any of his problems anymore. He said he just didn't want to be here. And when they asked if she could recall any significant arguments between Ken and Carolyn, she mentioned that about a month before the murders, Ken wanted to attend a conference, but he didn't want his wife to go with him because she had embarrassed him in front of his colleagues in the past. There wasn't context given as to how she embarrassed him, but it caused a fight because Carolyn didn't want him to go out of town alone.
But then there's also the fact that she had come home that one time and he had been cheating, so she probably didn't want him going out of town either. They needed to confront Adriana now about the $20,000. So they asked if Ken had ever given her a large sum of money. But of course, they didn't tell her how much. She said the largest amount she remembered receiving was just him helping her with plane tickets so she could go visit a sick relative in Mexico, and that was it. They said, "Well, what do you mean that's it? Has he helped you with anything else?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, like when her car broke down, he got it fixed, and at one point he was helping her get another one. He would give her a couple $100s for groceries, but the most was that trip to Mexico." Now the interview shifted to Carolyn again. And this time they pressed her about whether Ken had ever mentioned hurting or killing his wife.
Well, the first thing Adriana said was she knew Dr. Stahl very well, and he was not capable of doing something like that. Yeah, he has mood swings. Yes, he could be depressed. And yes, he could talk angrily about his wife and even break down crying. But there's just no way he would ever hurt anyone, especially his wife.
They do take an oath, do no harm. And they were thankful that they got all this information from Adriana. She had given them so much. She worked closely with Ken over the years. This interview was very valuable, but they did have to ask her a very uncomfortable question. They wanted to know if things had ever gotten romantic between the two of them. Adriana began to tear up. She said she had a lot of love for him, a lot. And over time, she did develop some kind of feelings towards him, but she did not pursue anything. However, there was a time that Ken offered to take her on a date. It was casual, and she said she went. After that, they hung out on other occasions, like going to lunch together or talking on the phone. The detectives felt like she was holding back. Like, come on, you're hanging out with this rich, prominent doctor who's paying for things in your life, and you never got romantic with him? She breaks down. She said, okay, yes, it happened once. They crossed the line, but that was it. She ended it over 3.5 years ago. She wasn't into dating a married man, and it was too complicated. She did not want anyone to get hurt.
They were still close, but she was interested in someone else at the time anyways. His name is Greg Stewart, who's her daughter's father. They'd been dating, she got pregnant with her second child, a girl, and they ended up breaking up later on. They even pressed her about whether Greg knew about Ken. She was like, yeah, he knew he was her boss, but no, there were no jealousy or conflicts there. Adriana told detectives that Ken just didn't have any enemies. However, she pointed out that Carolyn had hired a private investigator to snoop around and monitor Ken's movements, even going to where he was performing surgeries for patients just to make sure he was really performing the surgeries. So, the detectives were satisfied with the information that Adriana had provided to them. They felt that she was being genuine and they thanked her for her time. But they did consider a theory where Carolyn might have been the one who tried to arrange something violent to occur against her husband. But as they tried to find any financial or any other evidence supporting this theory, nothing was found.
Months went by. It was now October. Detective Felipe, who they called Phil Villalobos, and Brian Heaney were assigned to take a fresh look at this case. After reviewing the original investigation, they focused on 3 primary theories. The first was that Kenneth and Carolyn had been killed over a business dispute. The earlier investigation had briefly considered whether Ken had been involved in insurance fraud or maybe other questionable dealings with professional associates. However, when these new detectives interviewed his partners and other people connected to his work, no evidence of financial misconduct or motive ever surfaced.
The second theory centered on Kenneth himself. Investigators considered the possibility that he had grown deeply depressed about his failing marriage and personal life. And under that scenario, he may have wanted to die, but also wanted to make sure his estate would go to his son rather than Carolyn. To add to that theory, there was the unexplained $20,000 withdrawal, which raised the possibility that he could have hired someone to kill Carolyn, and maybe even possibly himself.
Finally, the third theory was that the couple had simply crossed paths with a random violent individual on Ortega Highway. Villalobos and Heaney found themselves drawn most strongly to the second possibility. And as they dug deeper, they reviewed Ken's cell phone records. This is different from his pager logs. And that's when a pattern emerged, one that the previous detectives had already visited. They discovered multiple calls placed on the day of the murders to the same number that had paged him, Adriana Vasco's number. I know the other detectives had explored all of the theories and interviewed her extensively.
But by revisiting Ken's phone records, they noticed the repeated contacts with Adriana's number the day of the murders, and they thought it was way too frequent for casual conversation, even as friends and coworkers. So realizing they needed deeper context, detectives discreetly interviewed Adriana's coworkers.
Yeah, and they described Adriana openly discussing Ken all the time, portraying him as someone deeply involved in her life, providing significant emotional and financial support. Now, some of that did correlate to what they already knew, but they confirmed that Ken would call Adriana while she was working and sometimes stop by unexpectedly to drop off cash, pick her up for lunch. And this was recent, like the same year that Ken was killed, not 3.5 years ago.
The coworkers' accounts sharply contradicted Adriana's initial explanations. Detectives became convinced Adriana was holding something significant back. So, that October, nearly a year after the killings, they sat down once again with Adriana.
This time, there was more of a plan. Villalobos told his partner that he was Hispanic, and so Adriana was as well, and that would make them build rapport easily. He could relate to her, so he was going to play good cop, and Heaney would come out swinging. Unfortunately, Villalobos was wrong. Hispanic or not, Adriana took a liking to Heaney, so he took the lead on trying to appeal to her emotions. They laughed together, they had small talk, and what they said to her was, "We're just new to the case, so we're just going to go through everything one more time." Adriana had to repeat most of everything she already explained in her previous interview. However, because they were building rapport, she provided a little more information about her and Ken's relationship. For example, she said that he would lie to his wife and say that he was on call, but he wasn't at the hospital. He was with Adriana. And how it all ended wasn't so simple like she previously told other detectives. This time she said Ken's wife found her phone number, which she did say last time, but she also found the phone number for Greg's parents. Now, Greg is the father of Adriana's young daughter, and Carolyn pretended to be somebody else. She was calling under the guise of Adriana winning some kind of contest or something just to get information about her. And eventually, this led to Ken calling Adriana and then putting her on the phone with his wife. You know how sometimes people do that? They're like, tell me you're not cheating or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, so uncomfortable.
It was one of those things where Ken was like, listen, my wife needs to know there's nothing going on between us. So she ended up having to tell his wife exactly that, just so they'd stop fighting. But by the fall of 1996, she swore the relationship was done. And for her, it really was over. She told the detective that Ken still tried to pursue her, even though they weren't physical anymore. They stayed emotionally close. But she made it clear she wasn't always comfortable with how much he called and checked up on her. Like he would constantly want to know what she was doing and who she was with all the time.
And it was especially uncomfortable because around that same time is when she got into that new relationship with Greg Stewart. And she did not want Ken to make this new relationship complicated. But he was still calling. And Greg tried to be understanding at first, thinking, okay, it's her boss. She's got a really good job. I'm not sure how much he really knew about the entire context of their relationship at this point. But nevertheless, Ken at one time comes over Greg and Adriana's house, goes inside, is venting to both of them, lying on their bed. And that felt really inappropriate. Adriana even revealed to these two new detectives things that she had not told the other one, specifically how she met Greg. She explained that she had been in a really low place in her life and actually wanted to end it herself. So she went to a psychiatric facility to get help. And when she was getting treatment, Greg was being treated for schizophrenia.
Eventually, she saw hope in that relationship. One of the reasons is because she was trying to close the door on things that had already happened with Ken, especially since she knew he wasn't going to leave his wife. So she told the detective she deliberately got pregnant with Greg's baby so that she could just completely move on in hopes that Ken would stop pressuring her.
In some ways, he did. But then her relationship with Greg became toxic. He was not stable. He had been violent with her. So again, she began relying on Ken. Investigators now have another theory. Maybe Greg got so enraged with the entire situation that he killed Ken and Carolyn. But Adriana said there's just no way. He didn't own a gun, and there was no money transferred to him, meaning he was not living an extraordinary life. She didn't see him spending more or anything like that. Adriana maintained her stance. She repeated her denials of any recent romantic involvement or large financial transactions. But this time, detectives had something she couldn't easily dismiss: concrete proof of multiple phone calls on the very day that Ken and Carolyn were killed. The records clearly showed Adriana had spoken to Ken numerous times, including one very suspicious call close to the estimated time of the murders.
Adriana became emotional and insisted that she had already told them everything. Detective Heaney told her she was not in trouble, but he said that Ken had been deeply troubled, and he may have told her some really important information. So he urged her to think carefully. Did he ever tell you to keep a secret? They tried to convince her that her face gave it all away, and they could tell that she was hiding something, but she broke down, saying that they were wrong.
At one point, she was flat out asked if she helped plan the murders. She immediately told them no. They said, prove it then. Take a polygraph. She's like, why is that necessary? Because of phone calls to my boss? I mean, it wasn't unusual, and they could look back at months and months, even years worth of these phone logs. She had always called him at all hours. And sure, sometimes it was personal, but it didn't mean she was guilty of anything. And she's bawling her eyes out. She had been there for hours. She never admitted to anything. She was right, though. They had nothing to go on. And at the end of the night, they finally stopped. They could have arrested her, though, because she did have an outstanding traffic violation. She was driving on a suspended license, but they decided no. Instead, we're going to follow her home. We're going to say we're trying to keep her safe. But instead, we're going to observe where she lived, who she lived with. And at the time, she was back living with her ex, Greg Stewart, and his family. Remember, the father of her daughter. They were not together. This was just out of convenience. And now, I thought this part was interesting. The detectives ask, "Can we come inside?" And she lets them in. And that opens the door because that's when they encounter Greg himself. And they tell him why they're there, to investigate the murders of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And he pretty much already knew that.
Greg was completely comfortable speaking with them, and they asked him a weird question. They were desperate for a direction to go in, but they said, "Who would you look at if you were investigating a murder of someone close to your ex-girlfriend over here," pointing to Adriana. And Greg said, "Well, I would look at Adriana's boyfriend, Tony." Now, the detectives had never heard of a Tony before. Adriana had not been forthcoming about dating somebody new. It sounded like Greg had some animosity, so they don't really take it seriously. However, they do ask Greg if he would be willing to come down to the police station for a formal interview the next day, and he says yes. It's good to have him corroborate some of the things that Adriana said, and he does. Even the part about Ken coming over to their house and laying on their bed and having him feel uncomfortable about it. Greg told the detectives Ken gave him money because he wanted Greg to take care of Adriana, but Greg admitted that he just used it on drugs.
And now they press him on this Tony guy. And Greg said, well, he's a younger man, he's younger than Adriana, and they met at an apartment complex in Anaheim. He was a maintenance worker, he thought. He's light-skinned, Hispanic, about 5'8", and 160 pounds. Greg said Adriana was scared of him, that he was volatile and possessive, and frequently involved with substances and weapons. And I kept wondering, if she's scared, then why is she dating this man?
Apparently, once she was involved, she felt trapped, especially since Ken had also become involved with Tony through her introductions.
What do you mean he became involved with Tony?
They weren't entirely sure, but they were still working on Greg, and shockingly, Greg also confessed something very chilling. Ken had once openly discussed with him ways that Carolyn could be killed, mentioning methods like poison, forcing her off the road, or even shooting her. And Greg insisted he treated the conversations as hypothetical, never really believing Ken was serious. But now, the reality of Ken's violent demise lent horrifying credibility to those conversations.
I mean, have you ever asked someone, like, what ways could I kill my whoever? That seems kind of strange. I don't think normal people are doing that. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because, like, that's weird.
But digging deeper, detectives interviewed Greg's parents, Nancy and James Stewart, who had an intricate relationship with Adriana due to their shared granddaughter. They kept Adriana close even though she and their son were broken up. First, they admitted they knew she was involved with Ken while she was with Tony. In what way, they weren't sure, but they got a phone call one morning from a woman who was screaming and wanting to know why someone who lived in the Stewart household had been calling her husband, Dr. Stahl. What they didn't know was Ken and Dr. Stahl were the same person. Of course, they know it now.
And they know that that was Carolyn that was calling.
Right.
So the Stewarts had also met Tony, and they did not like him. They said he was rude, but the most critical thing that James Stewart revealed was in reference to a gun. He was a firearm enthusiast, and he had to go pick up a shotgun that he won in a raffle from a sporting goods store. Adriana came with him. She was waiting, and she points to one of the guns in the display and says, "Oh, I bought a similar one for Tony." He found that to be really odd. Why was she buying a firearm for her new boyfriend? When the detectives asked James what kind of gun it was, he said a large stainless steel revolver, possibly a Taurus. Now, this was alarming because ballistics indicated the murder weapon was likely a revolver. So James did confront Adriana after he heard about the murders. She said, "Oh, I never gave that gun to Tony. I returned it." But wait, there's more. Nancy tells the detectives that she had a very weird conversation with Adriana just days before the murder. Apparently, Adriana had been stressed. She told Nancy she took a long drive along a scenic highway in Orange County to relieve her stress. Can you guess which highway?
Ortega.
Exactly.
With these statements, detectives began connecting the dots. Ken to Adriana, Adriana to Tony, and Tony to a possible firearm. When the detectives asked Stewart if anything else stood out to them, the only thing that came to mind was some long-distance calls on their home phone bill placed by Adriana to North Carolina. The detectives don't know if this is of any importance, but they have always been suspicious of Adriana.
But it didn't really make any sense because why would Adriana want to kill Ken? He's, helping her financially and been there for her.
What if he wrote her into the will?
Oh, okay, so everything's going to go to her or something if the wife and him die?
Or maybe she could be lying, and maybe she wanted something more out of the relationship. Maybe she was telling him to divorce his wife, and he wasn't doing it, so she took matters into her own hands.
It could be. So detectives go back to Turner's Outdoorsman. This is the gun shop. And they asked to see records. It turned out that Adriana did attempt to buy a gun back on September 26th of 1999, less than 2 months before the murders.
That doesn't seem like a coincidence, does it?
No, but it wasn't a revolver. She tried to purchase a semi-automatic rifle, and she paid in cash. Now, it's mandatory to present your identification, and there's also a waiting period here in California before a person can take ownership. What happened was, after that waiting period, it just elapsed, and Adriana never finalized the purchase. She received a refund instead. So even though she was telling the truth by saying she didn't take possession of the weapon, she was still involved in attempting to purchase a firearm. And wait, because it's going to get even weirder. While these new detectives are going in this new direction, they start scouring records from local businesses. And they find out Adriana rented a storage unit in Anaheim.
That's not a good sign.
No, it's not. It reminds me of Scott Peterson. But then again, people can have storage units for completely normal reasons. But this wasn't exactly that, because inside, they find a treasure trove of personal items related to Adriana and Ken's relationship, a paper trail of letters, bank information, and even photos of them together, private photos. And there were also photos of Adriana with this unknown dark-haired man, and he also appeared in a mugshot photo as well. They confiscated several of these items as evidence because why hide these things here? It's almost like they pointed to the murders. And who was the man in the photos? It was very odd.
They were still digging and found a DUI on Adriana's record from October of 1999. In the police report, it stated that there was a passenger in the car with her, a man named Tony Satin. This was important because they didn't have a last name prior to that moment, and they were able to confirm that Tony Staten was a maintenance worker in Avanti Apartments, where Adriana had been living in late of 1999. When detectives reached out to Avanti Apartments for more information about Tony, they provided them with his job application, which listed his previous hometown as Greenville, North Carolina, his birthday, his social security number, and there was an ID photo. Guess who it matched?
I'm guessing it's the guy in the photo with Adriana and the mugshot.
That's right.
Why would a photo of Tony be hidden in a storage unit rented by Adriana? Isn't that kind of weird? And remember, the Stewarts said that Adriana was making long-distance phone calls to North Carolina recently. Keep that in mind.
Detectives quickly visited Avanti apartment complex, interviewing neighbors who described Tony as aggressive, suspicious, deeply involved in criminal activities, including buying and selling substances and guns. And not only that, one of the residents provided information about Tony purchasing a revolver from one of their friends.
A revolver. So maybe that's why Adriana never went to pick up the other firearm, because they didn't want a paper trail. And wait, I told you it's going to get weirder. There were other people living at this apartment complex that were well aware of this shadiness that was going on with Tony. And they remember seeing Tony and Adriana leaving the complex on the night of the murders. And what stuck out to them was how they were dressed, head to toe in black. Later on, only Tony returned, and he was flaunting a big wad of cash in the days following this. He told people he was on an undercover mission. Yeah.
And the residents were scared, but he wasn't living there anymore, so maybe they felt more comfortable talking, because they said he was trying to get people to get rid of that revolver, to hide it inside their apartment.
And he kept moving ammunition between different units. Remember, he's a maintenance man, and he was telling people not to talk or else he would hurt them.
Wow. But guess what?
What?
There's no Tony Satin.
What do you mean there's no Tony?
Well, I mean, he existed, but when detectives ran Tony Satin through criminal databases, it initially came up with nothing. So they decided to contact law enforcement in North Carolina, and as soon as they shared that picture of Tony, they got back to California detectives right away and said his real name was Dennis Earl Godley.
But he was definitely far from being godly, that's for sure. And why do they always have a triple name?
I don't know, but he had a violent criminal history dating all the way back to when he was just a teenager. Dennis's record included convictions for burglary, substance sales, weapons violations, and violent attacks on others. He was known to be armed, dangerous, and had a history of evading authorities. Investigators learned Dennis had previously escaped custody in Virginia, fleeing to California shortly before meeting Adriana.
And it didn't seem like Adriana had any idea that this man that she was associating with had this background. She didn't even know his real name or his rap sheet.
So it seems she introduced Ken to a violent criminal. But why?
The only thing that made sense with Dennis's criminal past, now that it's fully in view, is what investigators feared the worst. That Ken's suspicious cash withdrawal was a payment connected to Carolyn's murder. And this was most likely the hired hitman, Dennis, aka Tony. But the investigation still held one critical mystery. Why was Ken himself killed? Had something gone wrong that night? And I gotta give it to these two detectives. They had done so much for this case nonstop. And in November of 2000, they decided to track down Dennis Godley to a jail in Virginia. Now, he had fled back to North Carolina first. By the summer of 2000s, he had a warrant out for his arrest. And when he was captured, he said something very interesting. He made a cryptic reference about facing life in prison for something he did in California.
But instead, they charged him on something for Virginia, and that's how he landed there on unrelated charges.
Exactly.
It was interesting that Adriana was calling someone in North Carolina, and he had been back in North Carolina after the murders. So detectives got face-to-face with Dennis, but he denied any involvement in Ken and Carolyn's murders. He admitted knowing Adriana, but he made it sound like it was very casual, that it was just physical, and they didn't have any kind of commitment. He also distanced himself from any direct connection to Ken or the murders. He said he had an alibi that night. He was with Adriana. They had gone to the block at Orange, it's a shopping center, but never went anywhere near Ortega Highway, and he had never met Ken.
So now they go back to California. They confront Adriana now that they have way more information.
So with all this new information, they must have a new theory.
Well, they had a working theory because it could change, but it was that Dr. Kenneth Stahl didn't have much time left to live. Because per the medical examiner, even after the quadruple bypass in July of 1999, just a month before he was murdered, he was only given a 20% chance of living. His heart was so congested that during the autopsy, the medical examiner said that he didn't have much time left. Whether Ken knew that or not was another story. But this theory is that he wanted out of his marriage. But what they found out is he could have easily gotten a divorce. He had a prenuptial agreement in place, and these detectives tracked that down. But no, they thought he wanted to keep everything. So he turned to his former lover, Adriana, who he had confided in for so many years, hoping that she would know a shady person who could kill his wife.
They think Adriana connected Ken to Tony.
And on the night of November 20th, 1999, that Adriana and Dennis had left their Anaheim apartment complex armed with a .357 caliber revolver. They drove out to Ortega Highway where the Stahls were ambushed. Now, I forgot to mention that there was another reason they thought Adriana was involved, in way more than just connecting Ken and Tony. It was because in the weeks following the murders, she was seen wearing really expensive jewelry. And her supervisor took note and said, "Oh, it's really pretty." And Adriana said, "Oh, I got it as a gift from my boyfriend, Tony. He has rich parents." But that wasn't true. According to bank records, Tony had run out of money in the months leading up to the murders. They felt like they had their killers, but they still didn't understand the motive in its entirety. But they go back to California to present their findings to the DA, hoping they have enough for an arrest. Now, interestingly, by this time, Adriana's already in jail as well. Yes, on those traffic offenses. So both her and Dennis, they're not going anywhere at this moment. Dennis, not for a long time. But Adriana was set for release on December 23rd. So they felt like they needed to move fast.
They knew she had a pattern of moving to different places, changing her phone number, getting different jobs, and they were worried that she might flee back to Mexico where she had family.
And they knew that would make getting her back to the US very difficult.
So they only had 4 weeks to make this case as strong as possible. And right now, it was pretty much circumstantial and relying a lot on people they interviewed. As far as physical evidence was concerned, that was lacking.
When they alerted Adriana's ex, Greg, and his parents that they located Tony, aka Dennis, and that he was in custody, they called the detectives back the very next day and said they talked to Adriana on the phone from jail. Once she found out the news, she was shocked and scared, and she blurted out, "Oh my God, he can put me away forever." This was, of course, according to her ex, Greg. So how true it was, they weren't sure. Sure enough, Adriana contacted the detectives, and they were expecting to talk to her soon anyway, so they had a plan. They said that they believed Dennis had killed the Stalls and was now shifting the blame on Adriana. So in order to protect her, they needed to know what her involvement was.
And he also mentioned they had evidence that was enough to arrest both of them for murder. Adriana said she would need an attorney and was now afraid for her child's lives. The detectives were not exactly lying to be harsh, but she put herself in that situation by associating herself with a known criminal. So unless she wanted to cooperate and give them information, they told her they can't provide any protection for her family. They also told her that they had photos of her and Dennis together, which, by the way, she was still calling him Tony. And at this point, she asked the detectives to please come talk to her first before pressing any charges.
We're going to try to make this short and to the point. They met her at the jail she was housed in out in Santa Ana. They took her in an interview room, and right away, she starts to tell them a story. She talked about how Ken had been making comments regarding finding a way to get rid of his wife, Carolyn, since 1995. She reiterated how in the beginning, she thought he was just venting, but over time, when he kept repeating himself, she thought that he could be serious. But Adriana said she had no interest in helping him with any of that. It wasn't until 1999 when she started dating Dennis, aka Tony, that she relapsed and she wasn't thinking clearly. There was one point where Tony started confiding in her about his violent past, and they were both under the influence of substances, and he threatened to hurt her and her children if she were ever to tell anyone. She started to get increasingly afraid for her own safety, and she felt trapped in the relationship because she felt like if she left him, he would do something to hurt her or her kids. So she slowly tried to distance herself. However, Tony was running out of money, and he was getting more and more aggressive and violent. And that's when Adriana said, Ken popped into her head. She just blurted out that her boss had been trying to find someone to kill his wife for a number of years, and he had the money. He was good for it. And when Tony got word of this, he immediately got interested and wanted to meet with Ken. Adriana said she regretted it from the moment she told him, but it already set things in motion.
She wanted to test the waters, so she mentioned Tony to Ken to gauge his interest, and he said he wanted to be put in touch. They all met over at Tony's place, and Ken offered to pay Tony $30,000 to make it look like he was trying to rob them, but instead kill his wife. After this, Tony and Adriana scoured the areas and decided on Ortega Highway, where there were no cameras, no lights, and not a lot of houses.
The plan, which just sickens me, was for Ken to make his wife believe that he was trying to work on their marriage. So for the last couple months before the hit was going to go down, Ken was being amicable. He even told Carolyn that he was going to give her a big surprise for her 44th birthday. She was looking forward to it so much, she even called her sister and told her how excited she was that her birthday was coming up because of the fact that Ken was going to do something special for her. And remember, this is a woman who used to pretend that he was gifting her things. So she was so excited, and he was playing on her emotions so much.
He said he would take her to dinner, and then afterward they would go on a scenic drive. And during that drive, a car would try to run them off the road. And once Ken pulled over, Tony would threaten them at gunpoint and end up shooting Carolyn in a robbery gone wrong. But it went really wrong.
And Adriana had no idea that Tony was jealous of Ken. Sure, he wanted the $30,000, but he also didn't want his girlfriend to be with the doctor. And that seemed like the plan all along, to get Carolyn out of the way so Adriana could feel comfortable being with Ken. Remember in the beginning, she said she ended the relationship with Ken because she didn't want to feel uncomfortable with the fact that she knew he was never going to leave his wife.
Adriana insisted to detectives that she tried to pull away from the plan, but Ken kept saying that she owed him for all the things he'd done for her in the past. Her job was basically to hold on to the money until the job was done. It was supposed to be $20K up front and then 10 more once it's done.
Okay, now for the big reveal. As terrible as that sounds, this is how Adriana said that everything went down. Tony came to her apartment that night and didn't even ask. He told her they were leaving. There wasn't anything to discuss. The decision had already been made. She got into the car and she drove him to a gas station near the freeway, exactly where he directed her to go. And that's where they waited. At some point, Ken arrived with Carolyn in the car beside him. They already knew what vehicle to look for because Ken had shown them the car ahead of time. So there would be no confusion and no mistakes. Once she spotted them, everything unfolded so fast. Tony told her to follow them, so she did. They drove toward Ortega Highway.
At some point along that road, Ken pulled over. There was no rushing him off the road, he just parked. And just like that, it began. Adriana said she drove past their car, and Tony told her to stop. She did as instructed. Then he told her to make a U-turn and circle back. Then he just told her to stop the car. She was close enough to see movement, but not close enough to see anything specific. That's when Tony got out of the car. He was carrying a revolver, and she said he was walking toward Ken's car.
Adriana said she stayed where she was. She told detectives she didn't actually see the shooting happen, but she heard it. Multiple gunshots, and Carolyn screaming. Those are the sounds she said she could never forget. Moments later, Tony came back to the car. She described him as tense, on edge, and completely different from how he had been just minutes earlier. He got in and he immediately warned her not to try anything, not to leave without him. So she didn't. She drove away into the darkness, but the drive didn't bring relief. It brought knowledge that Adriana said she wasn't expecting. At some point during that drive, Tony told her something had changed. He said he shot Ken too. According to Adriana, he told her that Ken had not followed directions. Up until that moment, she said she didn't know that Ken was going to be killed. That was not part of the plan.
Afterward, Tony took the revolver and threw it off the Huntington Beach pier into the ocean, making sure it would never be recovered. In the weeks that followed, Adriana described his behavior as increasingly unstable, more paranoid, more unpredictable. Tony already had the $20K, which he quickly spent mostly on drugs. And eventually, she said Tony disappeared. And Adriana said when he was gone, she felt something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief.
But it didn't erase what had happened. She admitted she should have gone to law enforcement sooner, but she believed she was already too involved and that no one would be able to protect her or her children if she spoke up. Before the interview ended, detectives made something very clear. She had spoken to them voluntarily. No promises had been offered to her. She was still going to be charged with murder. When authorities told Carolyn's family the truth, that her own husband had hired someone to kill her, but instead the killer, out of jealousy and rage, turned the gun on Ken and killed them both, they weren't actually surprised that Ken set everything up. But her mother did speak out and say that she was heartbroken and angry.
On December 12th of 2000, the Orange County Sheriff's Department publicly announced murder charges against Adriana Vasco and Dennis Godley for the double homicide. Those who knew the couple were in complete shock once again, struggling to understand how a successful doctor like Kenneth Stahl could orchestrate his own wife's murder, only to become a victim himself.
But detectives knew their job wasn't finished yet. The emotional, tangled web still held questions. Could they prove Adriana's claims about her fear of Godley? How involved was she really? And would a jury see Adriana as another victim or hold her equally accountable alongside Dennis Godley? One thing was clear. Ken's darkest secrets had finally come to light, exposing a reality more horrifying than anyone had imagined. And now the justice system had to untangle the twisted truths to deliver justice for Carolyn, the innocent woman who had been caught in a deadly trap set by the man that she trusted the most.
By November of 2002, it was time for justice to unfold in court. All eyes are on Adriana Vasco as she entered the courtroom appearing fragile and nervous, facing charges of first-degree murder. Dennis would be tried separately and after Adriana. Prosecutors began laying out a meticulous and chilling narrative led by veteran homicide prosecutor Walter Schwarm. They presented extensive forensic evidence gathered by Lori Crutchfield and a detailed testimony from responding officers, including Officer Tony Castillo, who recounted discovering the crime scene that horrific night on Ortega Highway. Every detail, the positioning of bodies, the trail of blood, the absence of shell casings, were completely laid out before the jury.
The prosecution's strongest evidence came directly from Adriana herself, her jailhouse confession, which we told you about. Jurors listened carefully as Adriana's recorded words described in explicit detail how she had introduced Ken to Dennis Godley, facilitated meetings and payments, and ultimately drove Dennis to the murder scene.
The prosecution also called multiple witnesses, including Adriana's former coworkers. They recounted explicit conversations with Adriana about Ken's marital troubles and her admissions that he provided regular financial support. Witnesses described how Adriana had openly portrayed Ken to them as deeply unhappy and emotionally trapped in his marriage, describing Carolyn negatively and frequently.
But of course, Adriana's defense team fought back vigorously, led by experienced defense attorney Robert Viethouse. The defense aimed to humanize Adriana, portraying her not as a calculated conspirator, but as a vulnerable woman trapped in a traumatic circumstance. The central argument of her defense was that Adriana had been psychologically manipulated and terrorized by Dennis Godley, unable to stop events that she deeply regretted. They recounted how she was only 23 years old when she met Ken, how he showered her with gifts and pursued a romantic relationship with her even when she told him she thought it wasn't right. A critical moment of the defense came when psychologist Dr. Nancy Kaiser Boyd testified. Now, this doctor was renowned in specializing in psychological trauma and mistreatment. She explained Adriana's state of mind through the lens of battered woman syndrome. Under careful questioning, Dr. Kaiser Boyd described how Adriana's extensive history of toxic relationships and emotional trauma had profoundly compromised her decision-making abilities.
The psychologist detailed Adriana's unstable childhood in Mexico, the loss of her mother in a traumatic car accident, and subsequent relationships characterized by violence, manipulation, and fear. She asserted that such trauma had left Adriana psychologically vulnerable, unable to fully comprehend the severity of her actions or safely escape the influence Dennis had over her once the events were in motion. However, during cross-examination, prosecutors challenged Dr. Kaiser Boyd, emphasizing that Adriana had multiple opportunities to seek help or alert authorities, but she had chosen not to, suggesting that she had actively participated in events rather than passively experiencing them.
Adriana herself took the stand as well, providing emotional testimony that riveted the entire courtroom because through tears she recounted the night of the murders, reiterating that she never expected Ken to be killed. She described vividly her shock and horror on hearing gunshots and Carolyn's screams, maintaining that she had been paralyzed by fear, that she was trapped by Dennis's threats, and genuinely believed that no one would help protect her.
Yet, prosecutors countered by confronting Adriana with explicit contradictions between her emotional testimony and her earlier recorded confession. Her detailed knowledge of Ken's violent intentions, her facilitation of meetings, and even her attempted firearm purchase at Turner's Outdoorsman in September of 1999, highlighting the clear premeditation involved.
As the trial concluded, the courtroom was tense. They were awaiting the jury's verdict. The jurors carefully considered the extensive evidence, the emotional testimonies, and competing psychological explanations. And finally, after deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict. Adriana Vasco was found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Carolyn Opie Stahl and guilty of second-degree murder in Kenneth Stahl's death. Adriana just dropped her head as the verdict was read. She was visibly shaken by the consequences that she was now facing. At sentencing, family members from both sides delivered powerful statements.
Adriana herself addressed the court tearfully, apologizing deeply to the victims' families, acknowledging clearly that she should have gone to the authorities earlier, admitting that her failure to act had irreparably destroyed lives. Adriana's sister, Norma Luna, pleaded for mercy, describing Adriana as a loving mother, deeply damaged by a lifetime of mistreatment. James Stewart, father of Adriana's former partner Greg, also spoke, highlighting Adriana's previously positive qualities and arguing her actions stemmed from fear rather than malicious intent. The judge considered the arguments carefully, acknowledging Adriana's difficult past, but firmly asserting the severity of her role in the murders. Adriana was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Carolyn's murder, plus an additional 15 years to life for Kenneth's murder, to be served consecutively.
Months later, Dennis Earl Godley faced his own day in court, and rather than proceed with a prolonged trial, he chose to enter a guilty plea, admitting responsibility for both of the murders. Prosecutors carefully confirmed no secret deal had influenced his plea, which he acknowledged under questioning by the judge.
In June of 2004, the judge sentenced Dennis Godley to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, bringing the legal chapter of this tragic saga to a close.
As the courtroom cleared out, all of the people involved, the families, the attorneys, the detectives, they were left reflecting deeply on the series of events that led to Ken and Carolyn's violent deaths. The trial had revealed disturbing truths, exposing how hidden secrets, manipulation, and betrayal had destroyed lives forever. People aren't perfect. Murder is not the answer. An innocent woman was killed that night because a man decided divorce was too expensive. But in the end, he paid with his life. I'm sorry to both of their families, and we thank you so very much for being here for Carolyn and Kenneth's story today. We will see you in our very next video. Bye.